which do you see as like the kind of the major challenge or the piece that in particular needs focus right now? So it was emitters with motivation and cash, storage in proximity, the right business model, or another.
Yeah, I think with that list, I would most definitely start with the right business model. There are some extraordinary similarities between the CCS industry and the way it's evolving and the way the LNG industry started kind of 60 years ago. One of the challenges with CCS is that it requires considerable upfront capital. There's a lot of pre-productive capital involved before you then get the revenue stream. And then the question is, well, how resilient is that revenue stream?
Well, welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast, and I'm joined today by two of Gaffney Cline's greatest. We have Nick Fulford, who some of you may remember has recorded with us before, and Mark Wilkie, who's Carbon Management Director, Nick being Senior Director of Energy Transition. And we're here to talk more generally about the evolution of the carbon capture and storage value chain, in part because Decarb Connect and Gaffney Cline had a collaboration around a report on this, which will be in the podcast notes, and you're welcome to download that. But, that bluntly was put together sort of late last year, early this, and things have already moved on at a pace. So we'll also be looking for kind of more recent kind of perspectives and anything that the guys can share. So thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Nick, for joining me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Good. So we'll start with my classic lazy podcast person's question, which is to get my guests to introduce themselves. So Mark, as the first timer on the podcast, perhaps you could give us your background and how have you arrived at this point in time, by which I mean personally, professionally, what's drawn you into this kind of work?
Yeah, well, I've been in the energy sector 25 years, 20 years, believe it or not, in renewable energy. But it's been over the past 5 years, started broadening to looking at decarbonisation. So back in 2018, worked with Heineken, leading their renewable energy program. And from that, started to look at how we could maybe even increase that ambition to get to net zero by 2030. And through that, really started to kind of come across some of the major challenges of doing that, given the global footprint and the nature of the business. I joined Gaffney Cline in 2021, and that for me has kind of broadened again my experience really, particularly into the area of carbon capture and storage, which really builds on Gaffney Cline's kind of heritage in the oil and gas sector. But I'm currently looking at really building that capability in carbon management for Europe, Africa, Middle East for Gaffney Cline. And not just with our traditional clients, but also within the industrial sector. So this study we did with you is really quite interesting to kind of understand more broadly how that fitted with the industrial sector.
So for the purposes of this, because as everyone will soon hear, we are three Brits, but Mark is representing as we heard there, the EMEA Africa flag, and Nick, I'll come on to you. You're going to be waving the flag for North America, or at least giving us that perspective. But for those that haven't heard our previous podcast, could you give that same sort of sense of what's brought you to this work, personally and professionally, and then we'll go on into the main body of the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Well, I can beat Mark by a couple of years. Believe it or not, it was 1983 I started working for British Gas. And for most of my career, it's been a story of gas and LNG in particular. But I think, interestingly, at the point where Europe started to get very picky about its LNG supplies and the carbon footprint, particularly France, and an LNG contract that was disapproved by the French government, that provided a kind of an incentive, a kind of a wake-up call to the LNG industry in the US that they needed to start thinking about carbon. And so in a way, it was that that sort of drew me into the CCS space, through LNG. But of course, since then, a whole range of industries, ranging from sort of fossil fuel, petrochem, right down to cement, iron, steel, etc., have become interested. So really, the last 3 or 4 years has been really quite a ride, in the sense that we've gone from vague interest to how can I do something about this, to money being put in and steel being put together. So it's been an extraordinary journey, and one I continue to find fascinating as it kind of, it sort of develops on an almost daily basis.
Yeah, that sort of reflects a lot of what we at the Decarb Connect team see as well. In that, when I first built the business, I assumed it would be relatively slow moving. A lot of these industries have a reputation for perhaps being slower moving, very well established. But actually, the conversation around decarbonisation, the activity around it, seems to be shifting every 4 to 6 months, so that we're in such a different place than I would have expected 3 years ago when we launched. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production partner and sponsor, Jano Media, for their support in delivering the Decarb Connect podcast. Over the last few years, they've helped us to facilitate great conversations that connect us with our audience, and their skills and expertise mean that we get to concentrate exclusively on generating the content, the conversations that engage, inform, and inspire. Thanks for those personal intros. And then, Nick, I'll come to you just on Gaffney Cline. Can you just give it a kind of little oversight for those who aren't familiar with the business? We heard from Mark that you're moving into more of the industrial sectors as well. But what's the background to the business and the main focus?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Well, Gaffney Cline, sort of boutique energy consultancy. We've been around for 60 years now, so we've been on quite a journey. And throughout that time, the company has kind of reinvented itself a few times as the industry requirements have changed. And that's very much the case at the moment, that our traditional skills in oil and gas, particularly the sort of geoscience and the subsurface, that's the thing which equipped us to fairly quickly transition into the sort of CCS technology, particularly looking at the geological sequestration. And we've always had a fairly strong facilities group as well, who are, familiar with SMR, ATR, etc., in the context of gas processing, gas reforming. So really sort of put those two technologies together, and you've kind of got a kind of ready-made CCS, practice. So we've been able to sort of utilize that to get a little bit of a head start. And now, I was in the Singapore office the other day, and between Singapore, Houston, London, the amount of resource that we're spending now on CCS and energy transition work is really quite significant. It's probably almost half what we're doing at the moment, I would say. So that's really how we got into it, and how we've developed from the sort of geoscience through to the sort of full value chain for CCS.
Okay, thanks for that kind of background. So we are here to talk about the evolution of the CCS value chain. I mean, there's no getting away from it. Wherever you sit in the politics of climate, CCS is a key part of the discussion. You're either in the camp that sees it as the central, middle, essential ground, or perhaps other companies or other points of view see it as the big question mark, the big problem. But we are here to talk about the fact that the CCS value chain is evolving. Wherever you sit in your political views on it, deals are being done, business models are being formed. So we'll get into that. And maybe, Mark, I'll start with you on this question, which is, we use this word evolution for a purpose. It does feel like not just the value chain, but the activity and the narrative and the discussions around CCS really are evolving. I'm wondering what shifts have you seen, perhaps even since you've come into Gaffney Cline, and particularly in the kind of more recent months. What is it that you're seeing, hearing, sensing is evolving?
I think it's a good question. And CCS as a concept has been around quite a number of years. It's seen a few kind of false dawns, but I think the general sense is that things are really moving. But first of all, one of the key evolutions is from an application perspective. So what we have seen up until, I'd say, fairly recently, in the last few years, dominant application for CCS was really for enhanced oil recovery. So that was taking CO2, principally from natural gas processing plants, and injecting that into a hydrocarbon reservoir to improve the flow of oil. What we are seeing fundamentally now is a complete shift in terms of the CCS projects that are being developed today to actually permanent sequestration of that CO2, which is fundamentally different. So really locking that CO2 away permanently on the ground. In parallel with that, there is also the U to CCUS utilization. So there is work going on. I'd say relatively small scale, but there are technologies and applications being developed. So I think, first of all, application is one key evolution point, and that is pretty clear. The second one, I think, is probably scale. In terms of scale, I mean in terms of volumes of CO2. So probably with the odd exceptions, like Sleipner up in Norway, which stores, I think it's about 1 million tons per annum. By and large, most of these projects are relatively small scale, kind of less than 1 million, certainly less than 500,000. What we're seeing now today are these clusters, these hubs being established. And the purpose of those are really to bring together multiple emitting sectors, to bring scale, so to bring volume, to increase utilization of these pieces of infrastructure, and therefore to bring economies of scale. And I think the third evolution is really the element of funding and financing. And I think that is by and large a recognition, certainly politically by a number of countries, that CCS is by no means the silver bullet. I don't think anybody who works in the sector believes that, but it does have a fundamental role. And if we are to get to net zero, it will have to play a role. And that is not just about decarbonising CO2 sources from burning of fossil fuels. That is about capturing process CO2 from things like cement manufacturers. So if we want to continue using cement, we're going to have to, in some form, have an amount of CCS. So for me, I think the key kind of piece of evolution over the past 3 years is probably application, so move towards sequestration, scale. It's rapidly growing, and we see it continuing, and then support, so policy and financial support to underpin that. And I think with that, we're kind of seeing a next phase of evolution, which was, I guess, part of the discussions in the report was around commercial models and so on. That again, to me, is an indication of how things are maturing. We're kind of moving away from these pilot projects, these sort of largely government-funded, sponsored projects, into a world where actually there is an expectation in the not so distant future that this becomes a utility, and there are evolutions in terms of commercial models and how this can help again bring down costs and improve access. Yeah.
And Nick, from your seat in Houston, which is obviously the epicenter of all things energy in the US, I mean, the last few months have seen a real sharp change in energy, I would say, around this, or at least that's what it looks like. How does it feel to you? And yeah, what have you seen in that, again, around that kind of idea of how the value chain is evolving?
I couldn't agree more, Alex. It's the last the last 6 months even has seen this extraordinary sort of extrapolation in activity, and ultimately it's to do with sort of three things. One more general and another specific. And, one is the change of administration in the US and the adoption of a much more sort of carbon-centric federal policy. And then following on from that, we've got the infrastructure bill, which has introduced Department of Energy grants, different tax treatments, and so forth. And then we've got the Inflation Reduction Act, which has significantly bumped up the tax credits under 45Q. And essentially, it's created this kind of pot of free money, effectively, which developers and people like private equity players can sort of leverage and do what they will. And the result is both a kind of an engineering wave of activity where the geology is being investigated much more. People are kind of drilling and creating projects. And then the other aspect of it, which I find fascinating, is that for each of these projects, you've got your engineering team of geoscientists, engineers, process folks and what have you. And then you've kind of got this other team in the background who are, kind of Harvard MBAs, they're finance people. And behind the scenes, they'll assemble a kind of a revenue package, which might be 45Q, it might be California low carbon fuel standard, might be selling a product into Europe to get the kind of ETS bump. And behind the scenes, they're creating this kind of web of revenue mechanisms, partly out of the federal government initiatives and partly out of the international ones, to create some really quite robust financials behind some of these CCS projects. So it's this kind of two-pronged attack of the technology and the engineering coupled with these very ingenious ways of creating revenue.
That kind of partly maybe goes to answer my next question, which is how does this look and feel different between US, Canada, Europe, Asia? I mean, it definitely feels from a recent couple of events we've run in the States, very, very much in line with what you've just said, Nick, that the conversation is all about show me the money, what's the business model? And it's just a very commercial discussion. In Europe, it feels, I don't know, I can't put my finger on it, but I suppose because we don't have the same kind of tax equity structures or things like I don't know, it just feels like a very different conversation. So Mark, I wonder, like, if you were going to characterize the conversations you have in Europe, how does it differ from what we're sort of seeing and describing about North America?
I think, first of all, if you look at the regulatory framework, I think both within the US and Europe, the environmental aspect of these projects are regulated in slightly different ways. But I think the key difference is probably from the economics and financial perspective. So within Europe, these projects really are being sponsored directly by the governments. So within Northern Europe, we have the UK, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, all pushing ahead with their various programs. And in some cases, those governments are taking a stake in those projects through equity, or indirectly, they're obviously putting money into those projects and sharing risk. And I think as a consequence of that, economically, the European projects are more heavily regulated to ensure that obviously the government's money is being well spent. But it also creates a potential set of challenges in terms of developing those projects. And again, we've kind of seen that within the UK in terms of the pace of development. If you compare that with the US, as you say, the private capital markets really been encouraged to participate, and it's very clear what the potential sources of revenue are for those projects. So I think for me the kind of key distinctions are really how the European projects are being sponsored, and also as a consequence of that, how heavily they're being regulated. But I think what we are seeing also is almost a version 2, or an expectation there will be a version 2 of this, with a realization that if CCS is going to be part of the solution, then it has to scale, and you're just not simply going to scale it quickly enough to enable it to have a role. And so I think there is an expectation that the model that exists today will have to start to somehow evolve towards more of a merchant model, less a regulated model. And although the US is kind of seen as being very successful in terms of creating interest, also it isn't without its challenges. But I think we're still yet to kind of come up with what is the ideal model. I think ultimately, in terms of vision, if CCS is to become successful, it effectively needs to become another utility. It needs to be good value for money. It needs to be readily accessible, and the integrity and the safety of it, cannot be in question. And I think that ultimately is the vision. Now, how do you get there from an industry which is literally just starting and requires quite substantial amounts of capital and state backing to make it possible? There is quite a journey and quite an evolution that has to happen.
And I'm going to address this question to Nick, but Mark, do jump in. But Nick, you were saying before we came on air, you'd been in Singapore recently. We're not talking a lot about Asia today as a region in this, but I just wondered, what's your sense of the conversation there? Because much less well developed, far fewer projects in development. But what's the kind of tone or the level of interest in this kind of particularly the sequestration kind of hub or cluster opportunity versus point source capture? What's your sense of that?
Well, my sense is that interest is very high indeed. Interestingly, there's a number of Asian companies who are quite actively investing now in CCS in the US and Canada, for the very reason, a little bit like the shale gas boom, 10, 12 years ago. It's seen as this kind of hotbed of activity where people can learn and then take that learning and technology back to their own jurisdiction. One of the interesting differences between Asia and what's going on in the US is that when you think about the transport side of the transport and storage, you have to sort of put aside your preconception of a pipeline network and start thinking marine. Because, if you look at Japan, Singapore, many of the other sort of strong Asian economies, which have a sort of material CO2 output to be dealt with, the sequestration opportunities are very limited indeed. So many of these countries are looking much more proactively towards marine export and cross-border transactions compared to the US or Europe. So that's one of the differences. The other factor, of course, is that many of these countries are big energy importers, and they're thinking about how to potentially import gas, process it, export CO2. And on an industrial scale, clearly, there's the potential for CO2 hubs and a more sort of coordinated mechanism to enable some of the more hard to abate sectors to benefit from that economy of scale. So a very different set of drivers, but a lot of interest, a lot of keenness to kind of learn and think how to deploy the technology in their own country.
I think as well with Asia Pacific in general, the carbon market is still relatively immature. There is obviously voluntary carbon market within Australia, but outside of China, there isn't much materially of a compliance carbon market. So I think first of all that is a challenge for development of many projects there. But I think also what you see within Asia Pacific is a number of the national companies taking the lead on developing at least an initial demonstration project, and in the absence of carbon pricing and maybe some of that regulatory and policy framework which is being laid out elsewhere, and is kind of the foundation blocks really for development of some of these more advanced markets. You see the NOCs taking the lead, But I think, particularly within Asia Pacific, one of the really interesting areas is Australia. So I think we saw this week actually Santos signed off on 4 agreements for storage of CO2 through their Bayu-Undan project, which is up in the Northern Territory. So they're looking to take CO2 and inject it into a depleted gas field in Timor-Leste. And yeah, they're largely leveraging voluntary carbon market, the ACCU system in Australia. But again, I think it kind of exemplifies the importance of having the policy and regulatory framework as the foundation block. You kind of need that in order to set the ground rules, to kind of minimize the risk, investment, and long-term kind of ownership and operation of these projects. And Australia has managed to implement that, albeit kind of state by state. So I think as Nick says, the transboundary element is really interesting, and shipping, and I think seeing how some of these countries within Asia Pacific are beginning to lay out the sort of policy and regulatory framework will also be interesting. So we also got Indonesia beginning this year indicated that they would start to encourage the storage of CO2, which has been a kind of a complete switch from completely outlawing.
Okay, slight shift then. We'll go back to the kind of starting premise, which was this report that we put together and worked in partnership with you on. And one of the things that we'd been sort of pushing for, particularly from partly the industrials, but also from some of the project developers, was a sense of we mapped out the opportunity, we mapped out the interest, but what were the blockers, or more positively, what were the key elements that we needed to really come together for the value chain to come to full fruition? So things that came back from that were, we need emitters with a real motivation who are willing to make those upfront commitments. We need storage in proximity, although based on our off-air discussion before this, I'm interested to see whether you challenge that. And then the right business model. So I'll come back to you, Nick. Of those 3, or is there another, which do you see as like the kind of the major challenge, or the piece that in particular needs focus right now? So it was emitters with motivation and cash, storage in proximity, the right business model, or another.
Yeah, I think with that list, I would most definitely start with the right business model. I mentioned at the start of the podcast that a lot of my kind of background and career has been in LNG, and there are some extraordinary similarities between the CCS industry and the way it's evolving and the way the LNG industry started kind of 60 years ago. And one of the challenges with CCS is that it requires considerable upfront capital. There's a lot of pre-productive capital involved before you then get the revenue stream. And then the question is, well, how resilient is that revenue stream? For 2 reasons, really. One is that as with early LNG, it requires a very strong balance sheet and a very strong sort of credit element all the way along the value chain, from the emitter through the transportation, through the storage entity, because of this deployment of capital and because of the revenue risks and so forth in terms of this very long-term cash flow that's required. So that's one similarity. And even if you look at 45Q or some of the other mechanisms, they don't necessarily go into the long term. Even 45Q has a finite period to it, which is often not really enough to properly support the business case. So you kind of have to believe that some element of regulatory support or tax credit or something will continue indefinitely in order to get to the economics. And there are some investors who are so convinced in the determination of global societies to address CO2 that it's, well, whatever it costs, it'll have to be paid for. And then there are others who look at it and say, well, the whole industry is supported by government funds and subsidies, which could be switched off at any moment, given the sort of current fiscal crisis that most governments are encountering. So, I'm not going to invest. And then the other element of it, which again is a little bit like LNG, is that most of the CCS projects which are being built at the moment are relatively confined. It's maybe one big emitter and a sequestration site. And very rapidly, I think that business model is being exposed as being, somewhat vulnerable, because you've got, an emitter and a storage entity who depend on one another entirely for, a resilient cash flow. So that's why the industrial hubs, the larger scale projects are coming in. But creating that sort of market in CO2 is going to take some time. And until that happens, there is going to be these sort of very big exposures which people suffer from. But obviously, the other factors, are highly important as well. And maybe I should let Mark continue the answer and carry on with that.
It's very difficult to kind of to pick one. I know that's the question, but I think one of the challenges is that it is actually a multifaceted problem or challenge, let's say. So I think you're really, the biggest challenge, I think, is bringing together each of those facets at the right time. So from a commercial perspective, there's also huge coordination risk, not only along the CCS value chain between the emitter, the transportation, and the storage, but it also requires quite an amount of coordination between each of the emitters to commit to being part of a cluster, and ultimately to have sufficient volume to make that viable. And I think even with some of the more mature projects in terms of development, we see questions around how risk and liability can be commercially managed. And I think, again, that's where government is not only a bank, but it also can provide the guarantees and the assurance to the investors and the operators necessary to be able to make this a viable project. So I think the challenges even for the projects that are going through development at this point are addressing the commercial model, the potential risks and liabilities, and then ultimately the coordination between each of the various parties along the value chain and in proximity to those hubs and clusters, which is really necessary in order to make these viable whole projects.
Okay, well, on to the next big piece of the puzzle then, which is the financing required to get, whether it's a small or a medium or some of these mega hub projects off the ground. What is your sense of the appetite for investment and finance for these sorts of projects? Nick, I'm going to come back to you. I'm kind of interested in your kind of thoughts on, in the US, obviously we see the rise of the tax equity investor, or rather the rise, at least in CO2 terms, of a tax equity investor, because they were always there in renewables. But I wondered what's your sense of appetite for investment, and and then I'll come back to you, Mark, on other regions.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think that I would start that question with the comment that there are sort of two strands of incentive for financial institutions to invest. The first is obviously, pension funds, infrastructure funds, etc. Their whole role is to invest in these long-term projects and, benefit from the long-term cash flow. So there's a kind of a quantitative element where, there's a very hard-nosed look at the economics and whether it's an appropriate project to lend to. But then there's the other element, which is the sort of ESG side. And certainly for many of the European banks and traditional sources of funding for big energy infrastructure, there's this tremendously strong motivation to shift their investment portfolio away from carbon intensive fossil fuel projects to, you know, carbon related infrastructure that they can sort of champion as part of their investor relations and their ESG strategies. And the result of that is that, if I look at the lens through which, a typical investor will look at a CCUS project and the lens that they would traditionally have used for a oil or gas project, it's very, very different. So tolerance to risk is much higher. Expectations of returns is significantly lower, at least at the moment. And the result is that projects which normally wouldn't see the light of day because of the risk and the requirement for capital are actually being tolerated, and up to a point, and obviously people aren't betting the farm on this, but up to a point there's an acknowledgement that it's an emerging sector. Equally, some of the financial institutions are sort of looking at it thinking, well, this looks like it could be $1 trillion business, and we'd better not get left at the starting gate through not having invested. So there is this very forgiving environment at the moment for CCS, which is great for the industry because it's helping to get things moving. But in time, of course, that will tighten up, and a very much more robust set of criteria will be applied. So that's kind of how I see it at the moment.
I mean, I think particularly within Europe, Middle East, and to an extent Asia Pacific, just the limited number of projects means there's actually a shortage of projects rather than a shortage of capital. I think the conversations we've been having with lenders who have a mandate to support energy transition projects, they're really short of projects, and I think that is definitely the case. Certainly within Europe, and again, I think it just comes back to how the sector is being supported. I think that will change, that will evolve, and as I guess as the state kind of rolls back and it becomes maybe a more kind of open commercial model, there'll be a greater opportunity for investment projects. I think within the Middle East, the projects we're seeing there are largely being financed off balance sheet by the national oil companies, not exclusively. So that they are also entering into joint ventures, but again, relatively few projects which don't really require support from the private capital market. And I think that is in complete contrast to what we've seen in the US, where, as Nick said, we've got kind of virtually every range of investor, from equity investors, institutional investors, banks, looking to see how they can support this. And then Asia Pacific, I think, again, just a reflection of the relatively few number of projects. It's probably too early to say, but most of those projects are being funded really by the oil and gas operators that are developing the storage and the transportation infrastructure. So I think, I'd go along with sort of Nick's analysis, but I think it's probably too early to say what the appetite is more broadly until we kind of get through this first phase of just establishing the initial pieces of infrastructure and the market can scale.
So Nick, we've talked about evolution of the value chain from that point on financing through to who's getting involved, the business models and so forth. What, as we sort of close out this discussion, what would be, well, two things. One is, what's your sense of over the next year? What are you expecting to see in the next round of change? We've said that this is conversation, a sector, a range of technologies, projects that are changing all the time. What do you expect to see in this next phase? And then is there a call to action, or whether that's a group or a kind of type of activity that you think is needed to push this forward?
Well, very briefly, I kind of see those two questions as being linked in a way, because the as I look at the means of controlling carbon and moving to this lower carbon world, you've got the sort of CCUS school of thought, which is, well, we have these carbon intensive industries which need to be abated. And then there's the kind of visionary school of thought, which is, well, it's all very well doing this CCS, but at the end of the day, we need to move to hydrogen and completely green fuels. But, the reality is that CCS technology is proven. In many cases, the technology has been around for years, and it's a very deliverable strategy which has a material impact on carbon emissions. So for me, the next year, I think, might see an increasing recognition of that as the difficulties of a complete switch to carbon-free fuels start to become better understood, the costs become better understood. And so in terms of the call to action, I think it very much is trying to get a clearer strategy going moving forward, which perhaps places more emphasis on CCS and actually delivering carbon abatement technologies, as opposed to debating about these long-term visionary strategies, which may, probably will ultimately get delivered, but it's not something that's deliverable right now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. And Mark, your chance to close us out. What's your sense again on the kind of, this kind of short range future, what you're expecting to see, and again, a call to action or what you think is needed to really kind of keep stepping forward?
Yeah, I think there's general acceptance that CCS has a role to play. I think, as we kind of briefly discussed before the podcast, at the end it is a piece of infrastructure. It is going to take some time to develop and to implement, as with any infrastructure. The additional challenge we've got on top of that is it's obviously an entirely new type of infrastructure. So I think even if we're looking, when we talk about short term, I think if we're looking at the short term of 10 years, let's say, we really need to be taking steps right now to move on those initial projects, because it's going to take so long to see those through to fruition. I think, through the lens and through the looking specifically at the European market, I think the kind of medium-term challenge is really how do we shift from what is really a handful of projects and really leverage those to create a market that is big enough to take emissions from the region and do that quickly enough. So I think the big challenge is how do we move from the funding structure we've got today into something that is more commercial and enables more participation from other investors.
Yeah, well, speaking on, I guess, broadly on behalf of the members that we work with, I know that what the industrials need is kind of a combination of exactly what you said. They need that clarity on cost, business model, and when will it be a utility versus a project that takes up a lot of time and resource and has all this risk and not knowingness associated with it. So but as I said at the beginning to Nick, I feel like this conversation in general around decarbonisation, but particularly around CCS, seems to shift gears every 4 to 6 months. So by the next time we meet, let's say in a year's time, I'm sure we will have gone through a further 2 or 3 iterations in all the regions we've been talking about. But thank you, Nick. Thank you, Mark, for joining me today. It was a real pleasure to see you both and to hear from you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
At Jano Media, we recognise that great content has the power to create impactful and positive change for lives and society. Whether that's video, live streams, photography or podcasts, partnering with us will enable you to harness the power of content to engage, inform and inspire. Reach out to us today.